Thank you. Thanks to the Forest Stewards Guild for hosting this, and thanks to everyone for joining us. I guess as an initial matter, I'll just say that someone please yell out if you can't see my screen or you can't hear me very well. I'm going to talk for 20, 30, maybe 35 minutes, and we'll have plenty of time for questions. But if you're able to get my attention by yelling out, I wouldn't be too bummed to be interrupted if you have a pressing question or concern in the middle of all of this. So, really eager to get people's thoughts on this research at any time today. So, th- this presentation is about a landscape that's near and dear to my heart in the east side of the mountains in the great state of Oregon, the Malheur National Forest, a 1.7 million acre, seasonally dry, fire-prone landscape, not really too atypical of a lot of dry interior forests throughout the western United States. The landscape that I conducted this research on, I collected data in 10 different sites, which I show on the map here. Some of these sites experienced fire during the study period, some of them didn't. These sites encompassed a pretty broad range of dry forest types, ranging from classic, dry, old growth, ponderosa pine dominated sites to more moist, highly productive sites with a few ponderosa pine, but a lot of grand fir, Douglas fir, and other more moisture loving species. So, a real diversity of forest types across this landscape where we gathered data. All of this data was collected in inventoried roadless areas. And the data was originally collected in 2011 and 2012 as part of my PhD research. I cored live trees and I sawed up dead trees, trying to better understand historical, successional, and disturbance dynamics across a broad range of forest types that are found in this landscape, trying to determine if fire frequency um, varied across these landscapes, how historical forest structure and composition varied over time. The work involved coring quite a bit of live old growth trees, such as you see here, big old ponderosa pine. There's a particularly large ponderosa pine. The hand-powered increment borer you see in the foreground there is 32 inches, so allows us to reach the pith of most of these old growth trees, even the really big ones. It results in this collection of thousands of tree cores, and this is what the guest room in my house looks like. If you ever want to visit me, you'll find in the guest room everything that you'd expect: a fan, a vacuum cleaner, the mirror that I'm going to one of these days rehang in the bathroom after the remodel, and a couple thousand tree cores from young and old trees of different species on the Malheur National Forest. I'll zoom in on one of those boxes so you get a sense of what these old growth tree cores look like. I cored most of these trees many times in order to intercept the pith or the center of the tree. I'll zoom in there. I don't know if you can tell, but this core intercepted the middle of the tree. So picture a tree looking down on it, and there's an increment borer. I was able to intercept the pith. I cross-dated all of these tree rings and measured them to 100th of a millimeter precision. So the great thing about this data set is that I have not only precise information about radial growth over time, but I know exactly how old all these trees are, which is a pretty fun party trick. You take folks into the woods and you can tell them exactly how old these different trees that I cored are. Here's a mixed conifer stand of grand fir, Douglas fir, larch, and ponderosa pine, and different ages of those stands. Here's another stand. This was a fun stand in that it did have a very old ponderosa pine that had survived more than a dozen fires between the year 1400 and the late 1800s. So, as I said, this research was originally designed to better understand historical and successional dynamics, but a couple of years ago, when there was growing interest in old growth conservation, I thought to myself, well, it's too bad we don't really know that much about status and trends of old trees and dry forests like we have out on the Malheur National Forest. So maybe I could revisit all these trees and see how many of them are dead. I have no doubt that at least a few of them have died in the intervening 10 years. Trees die all the time. But the neat thing about this data set was, first it was randomly selected areas in unmanaged, unlogged areas, randomly selected trees, as you see here. And as I said, I had precise radial growth data, and I knew exactly how old they were. Here's what the species composition and age structure of the data set looks like. There's 6 species: lodgepole pine, western juniper, western larch, Rocky Mountain Douglas fir, grand fir, and ponderosa pine. On the x-axis of these graphics is the age in years of trees. Those those vertical dotted lines divide the data set into trees that are less than 150 years old, 150 to 300 years old, and the really old trees that are older than 300 years of age. This is what the data set looks like. So I thought to myself, all these trees were alive 10 years ago. I could revisit these trees and see how many have died and, generate some baseline data about how much mortality there is in these systems, which would inform what was at the time ongoing uh, policy work. So, here's an example of a site as I saw it when I cored a bunch of trees in it in 2011. And when I revisited it, there's quite a bit of mortality from fire. Out of the 10 sites where I cored trees more than 10 years ago, 4 of those sites had experienced fire, including stand replacing fire in the intervening 10 years. I was really pretty shocked to discover that even in sites that hadn't experienced fire, there was pretty significant mortality. It was honestly a little bit depressing to revisit these stands and these trees that I'd made friends with 10, 12 years ago, and gotten to know the hard way by screwing a 32-inch piece of metal into them, and to see how many of them have died. Uh, as an aside, I did a little side project to determine if coring trees itself resulted in mortality, for instance, being a vector for insect attack. And I actually found that there was no statistical difference between trees that were cored and trees of the same size and species that were not cored. In fact, the trees that were not cored died at a rate of mortality about 8% greater than the trees I had cored, although that difference wasn't statistically significant. So I don't think it was coring trees that made them die. Here is the results. I located a total of 1,615 trees, exactly 10 years, give or take 1 month after I originally cored them when they were alive. There are 6 species, wide range of diameters, wide range of ages. And the long and short of it is that between a quarter and a third of all the trees that I cored more than 10 years ago died during a 10-year observation period that went from 2010 or 2011 to 2020 or 2021, so 10 years. The paper that we published these results in is there below. You can find it online or email me and I'll send it to you. So 28% of trees died during a 10-year observation period. I converted that to annual mortality rate, and I want to compare the annual mortality rate that we observed to annual mortality rates from previous studies. One of the best and most interesting studies of background mortality rates of ponderosa pine is Jerry Franklin's work at 2 sites on the Metolius and in Pringle Falls, that was published in 1987. Dr. Franklin found that annual rates of mortality over the decades in which these trees were observed was about 0.31 or 0.52% a year. Um, The annual mortality rate that we found on our malheur sites of ponderosa pine more than 100 years old was 3.42. Even the sites that were unburned had significantly greater annual mortality rates, 2.34% per year. There have been other studies that investigated old growth, ponderosa pine mortality. Van Mantjem and colleagues estimated mortality rates of ponderosa pine greater than 450 years throughout the western United States, found an annual mortality rate of about 2%. The rate of mortality that I observed in the malheur exceeds that. In general, we're finding just really pretty exceptional rates of mortality in these unroaded, unlogged areas on the Malheur National Forest, pretty well in excess of what's been observed by most previous studies. Here's graphically how mortality in our study area breaks down with respect to species in both those unburned and those burned sites. The green bars are the trees that were alive after that 10-year observation period, and the red bars are trees that had died. I'm showing this in terms of proportion from 0 to 1 or 0 to 100% if that's easier for you. And these numbers here are the number of trees in that category. So after 10 years, there's 575 live ponderosa and 150 dead ponderosa. There was not significant difference in the propensity for different species to experience mortality in unburned sites, with the exception of western juniper and Douglas fir, does appear to experience lower rates of mortality than other species, which is kind of interesting. At burn sites, we observed no difference in mortality by species, although we had pretty few um, you know, samples from large lodgepole or western juniper in those burn sites. Um, but remarkably kind of consistent across the board death of different species in burn sites. So this is mortality by species composition. Here's mortality by age class, again, broken up into those three age classes that we investigated: trees less than 150 years of age, trees 150 to 300 years of age, and trees 300 plus years of age. These age classes, by the way, are totally arbitrary. I sort of just made them up. Although a lot of policy initiatives, including the proposed Northwest Forest Plan amendment, forest plan revisions for the Blue Mountains National Forests, and other proposed policy changes have proposed generally conserving trees greater than 150 years of age on the theory that those are the trees that were established before fire was excluded from these dry, fire-prone landscapes. And if you'll recall from one of the earlier figures I showed you, there was pretty distinct pulse of older trees established in the 1600s, which is where I come up with the 300-year age bin. Again, this data is broken out by proportion or percentage, if you will. The green bars are live trees, the red bars are dead trees. It did appear as though there was more young trees killed in burn sites than old trees, which is what you'd expect because young trees are generally smaller and they're more, they have thinner bark, branches closer to the ground, and are more prone to being killed by fire, although that wasn't a statistically significant difference. Again, pretty consistent mortality across age classes and species composition in burn sites. In unburned sites, we found that older trees were generally more prone to mortality than younger trees. We're losing more old trees than young trees, which is problematic, first of all, because we have so many less old trees than young trees. This graph shows the probability of mortality of age of trees in unburned and burned site. The way to read this is again on the y-axis, I'm showing proportion mortality ranging from about 20% chance of being killed to up to 80% chance of being killed. The red line is the actual fitted value from a statistical model, and the blue line is a smooth fit that allows you to visualize how the probability of mortality increases with age. Age is on the x-axis from, 0 to 600 or so years of age. Those little hash marks at the bottom of both graphs represent the density of observations. There are, of course, more young and middle-aged trees than very old trees. Again, broken out by unburned and burned sites, you can see that there's not really much of a tendency or trend for, in terms of age of trees killed in burned sites. Most trees had about a 50% chance of being killed in a fire, regardless of age or species. In unburned sites, the younger trees had only about a 20% chance of dying, whereas the older trees had almost a 40% chance of dying. So again, there's more mortality of the older trees in unburned stands, and we are losing, pretty shocking amount of old trees over just a 10-year period in these unburned sites. I should say too that we didn't find a lot of environmental variables or tree traits that did a good job of predicting mortality. I would have expected that competition would play a role in mortality, although none of the measures of competition that we tested proved to have a significant influence on mortality. We assume that's because, again, these are unmanaged, unlogged areas. The unburned sites haven't experienced fire that removed tree cover for more than 100 years. So the dry sites have less trees but less water. The moist sites have more trees more water. Overall, competition tends to be equalized across these sites. They're all experiencing pretty significant competition. The one variable that we found that was highly predictive of mortality was basal area increment, or the amount that these trees are growing, particularly basal area increment in the 5 years previous to when I cored them more than 10 years ago. So here you see basal area increment, um, scale basal area increment expressed in standard deviations from like minus 1.5 to 3 standard deviations. And again, the probability of mortality. And as you can see, trees that had significantly depressed radial growth, that is, trees that 5 years before I cored them, their radial growth was 1.5 standard deviations below the mean. Those trees had almost a 60% chance of dying relative to trees with average radial growth, whose chance of dying was 20% or less. So radial growth in these trees, which of course is heavily influenced by competition, does play a really strong role in mediating mortality dynamics in these dry forests. Trees that have access to ample water, light, etc., um, are not dying, but trees that are experiencing significant competitive pressures are dying at a much higher rate. This is a pretty profound influence on tree mortality. I hope that these graphs are not too complicated for folks. These are smooth fits, not maybe the linear fits that you would normally see in these types of graphs. But again, basically what you're seeing is a significantly increased chance of mortality when trees experience suppressed growth, which is probably really not all that surprising. This next graph does have the potential to really mess with people's mind. Really, it's just the two previous graphs that I showed you combined. So I'm showing the joint influence of basal area increment on this axis and tree age on this axis and the probability of mortality. And the way to read this graph is simply that young trees trees that are, say, 150, 100 years old, which say here, and that have strong radial growth, have very little chance of dying. But trees, as they get older, have an increased chance of dying. And trees that are older and have suppressed mortality have an even greater chance of dying. So there's sort of this interaction between the age of trees and their radial growth, whereby trees that are old and have suppressed radial growth are really pretty uniquely predisposed to mortality. If you're a tree that has below average radial growth and you're 300, 400, 500 years of age, your chance of dying during that observation period was in excess of 50%. And we're talking about trees that are 300, 400, 500 years of age. The idea that they have a 50% chance of dying in just a 10-year period is pretty shocking, right? So I was interested, my colleagues and I, and we were writing this paper and trying to figure out just how big of a problem this is that, old trees are more prone to dying than young trees. Because the thing is, in these dry forest landscapes, since fire has been suppressed, we have had a lot of growth and establishment of young trees. In fact, there were lots and lots, millions and millions and millions of trees that were established in the late 1800s, early 1900s, after fire was excluded from the landscape. And these young trees are dying, at a pretty high rate, although, there's millions and millions of them. So even if a lot of them die, there's still going to be lots left. And it occurred to us that, those young trees might replace old trees over time, right? So maybe the pretty exceptional mortality in old trees that we're observing over time may not be that big of a deal because as luck would have it, we have this massive cohort of younger trees, 100 and 150 years of age, that are there to replace them. So we tested this hypothesis with a fairly simple simulation model. And what we do here is apply the probability of mortality derived from a fancy statistical model to individual trees. So that's a number between 0 and 1. And then we draw a random number, which represents the sort of probabilistic, stochastic nature of tree mortality. And if that random number is larger than the probability of mortality, then the tree survives in this framework. And if the probability of mortality is higher than, the random number, then the tree dies. So tree either dies or it lives. And if it lives, every 10 years, we increase the size and age of it by 10 years so it remains in the data set. And then we repeat this simulation thousands of times in what statisticians call a Monte Carlo framework. So we have a sense not just of what happens over one simulated mortality over many decades, but the uncertainty that you get from running this simulation thousands of times. I think right here it says 1,000 times. I think the simulations in the paper might have been 10,000 times, but I don't remember. And we ran these simulations for a total of 7 decades. And here's what those simulation results look like. I'm first going to describe future demographics of trees that are 150 to 300 years of age. In terms of the proportion of trees that were present when I originally sampled trees in 2010 and 2011. There they are, proportion equals 1. So 100% of the trees are alive in decade 0, which corresponds to the period 2010 or 2011. And then for 7 decades to come, which puts us out to, the year 2080. And we tested 5 different scenarios: persistent trend, worsening trend, improving trend, and what we called the disturbance restoration and recovery from anomaly. As the title suggests, the persistent trend is just same probability of mortality over time as we observed in 10 years. In the worsening trend, things get worse for trees. It becomes hotter, drier, more competition, more fire, increased probability of dying. And in the improving trend, there's an improving trend. Trees are less prone to mortality over that 70-year period. There's also a disturbance restoration and recovery from anomaly trend. And in these scenarios, we contemplated the possibility that the 10 years worth of elevated mortality we observed was an anomaly, that was just 10 years. And after that 10-year period, in other words, as we're speaking right now in the 2020s, the probability of mortality of old trees will shrink to nearly zero and they won't be dying at the same rate. So here's what this looks like in decade number one, which incidentally is right now, the 2020s, the 2030s, the 2040s, 2050s through again the 2080s. Each of those individual dots is an individual simulation. If it helps, I'll put those box plots around the median and the first and third quantiles of those simulations. So what you see here is that in the persistent trend, worsening trend, and improving trend scenarios, 70, 80 years from now, in most simulations, we have less trees aged 150 to 300 years of age. So they are replaced by, to a certain extent, by trees that are currently less than 150 years of age, but not totally. If indeed what we've observed over the last 10 years is anomalous and mortality of trees shrinks to nearly zero, as we're speaking right now, and for the next 6 decades, we'll actually have even more trees 150 to 300 years of age, 70 or 80 years from now. But that depends on something that, you know, the climate, competition, fire dynamics, stabilizing and improving again as we speak right now, which doesn't seem to be happening. The most realistic scenarios that we're going to have, between a third and a quarter less 150 to 300-year-old trees on the landscape as we do now. So that's 150 to 300-year-old trees. What about 300-plus-year-old trees? Here's what those same scenarios indicate. Even under the most optimistic scenario, in which probability of trees 300 plus years of old reduces to approximately zero, as of right now, as we're speaking, under most simulations, we will still have less 300-year-old trees in 80 years from now than we do now. And under the more realistic scenarios in which, these trends stay the same or get a little bit worse or get a little bit better, we're probably still going to have a third or half as many 300 plus year old trees as we did 2010, 2011. So this is really just pretty bad news, although it's not unexpected. Really, this is just a very fancy statistical model that told you what you already know, which is that when a 300-year-old tree dies, you don't get it back next year or 10 years or even 100 years from now. It was 300 years of age. And that's, I think, pretty much all I had for you all. I'm pretty eager to take questions, although I lied. As I advanced through my slides, I realized I did have more. Here's the same model applied to species composition, right? Ponderosa pine, grand fir, Douglas fir, large juniper, lodgepole pine, color-coded. As you would expect, here's starting conditions. A little more than 50% of the trees between 150 to 300 years of age in our data set were grand fir. About 40% were ponderosa pine. And those percentages sort of converge over the decades. Because so many of the trees that are today less than 150 years of age are more shade tolerant species, Douglas fir and grand fir, those will be a higher percentage of old trees to the extent that young trees replace them over time. Here's 300-year-old trees. Again, ponderosa pine will decrease as a proportion of total trees, and grand fir, Douglas fir will increase. Again, not unexpected. If we're expecting younger trees to become old trees over time, there's going to be less of the shade-intolerant species like ponderosa pine and western larch, and more of the shade-tolerant species like grand fir. Oh, um, I did have more results to show. I totally forgot this. This is kind of neat. I thought that I would visually represent what's happening to these stands over time with some cartoons. So here you see a stand, and this is the year 2010. This is actual data. This is from a site where we collected data on Crane Creek. That's the CRA site if you read the paper. We got Douglas fir. It's a mixed conifer stand with Douglas fir, larch, ponderosa pine, and this is what one tiny slice of the data, what about two different sampling plots put together looked like in terms of the approximate size of trees in 2010. So here's after the first decade of simulations. This is just one of the close to median simulations that I ran. A lot of mortality of the older age classes of ponderosa pine, which is exactly what we observed in real life when we visited this stand in the year 2020. Here's 2030. Note that trees are getting bigger. 2040, 2050, 2060, 2070. And I think that that's, and last in 2080. So as you can see, there is pretty dramatic changes in species composition, even assuming that young trees grow up to be replacing the old trees. And we could theoretically continue to have quite a few 150 to 300-year-old trees, but we're simply not getting those 300-year trees back. On the off chance that this cartoon was interesting at all, I'll play it again for you, and then I really am done. So 10 years ago, present day, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 30 years from now, 40 years from now, 50 years from now, 60 years from now. I might have messed up my timeline there, but you get the idea. Want to thank the field crew that worked on this project. You see them here measuring trees. This is when I'm around. They're hard at work measuring trees. When I'm not around, I ask them to send photographs of them working, and they send me these photographs. They send me a photograph of them staring at their feet and playing with bugs. They're great kidders, these folks. More formal acknowledgement of some of the folks I worked with in the project and the folks that funded the work. It goes without saying that the funders haven't reviewed or authorized any of the stupid or dangerous things I've said. It's entirely on me. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Xander and open it up for any questions. I'm eager to hear what folks think about this work and the implications for the future and for other forest types outside, my favorite forest, the Malheur National Forest. Thanks again for having me.
Thank you so much, James. It's great presentation. I actually quite enjoyed the cartoon. I'm a visual person, and so I like that. Uh, Obviously a bit depressing. Yeah, and actually we already got questions, so I won't waste more time and we'll just dive in. Kai asked, what implications do you think this research has for informing changes to policy about forest management in the inland Northwest or even just the Blue Mountains?
Well, that's a great question, and it's sort of the question of the day. I'll mention first some other research colleagues and I published a couple years back, a paper led by Mike Vernon, in which we investigated radial growth dynamics of trees in stands that had been treated, they'd been thinned. And what we observed was very significant increases in radial growth in trees that had been thinned. So we know for a fact that when we mechanically thin these stands that have old trees in them, when we remove the young trees from those stands, the older trees respond positively and have a fighting chance to survive. So the basic takeaway is that if we want to continue to have old trees in these dry forest landscapes. We need to remove the young trees that are competing with them using mechanical thinning and perhaps also prescribed fire. In the unmanaged roadless areas where I collected this data, I think that we're pretty much locked into a future in which we're just not going to have nearly as many old trees. Hopefully that answers your question, but I'd be happy to discuss the management implications further.
Yeah, maybe building and feel free, Kai, to unmute, but maybe I wasn't paying close enough attention. But James, you had some good in the simulations into the future. You had a restoration simulation, and it feels like that ties in here to your comment. And so maybe you'd be willing to go back to um, that the slide. Yeah, let's see. I think you know what I mean here. Um, yeah, one of those. Yeah. Yes. So, can you just for people like me who maybe missed it the first time, can you talk a little bit about the disturbance restoration and yeah, making sure I'm
Yeah,
reading that correctly?
sure. So here we are in decade zero, which is either the year 2010 or 2011 when we originally located these trees. And the proportion equals one just indicates that 100% of the trees were alive at that time. And, here's the proportion of trees that are alive, present day. This is simulated results, but the simulated results were, you know, pretty close to what our actual observations were in the field. And decade two, which is the 2030s, decade three, the 2040s, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And what this is showing you is that we are going to be able to conserve trees and recruit new old trees over time if we can batter down that probability of mortality to close to zero or to, close to zero. Again, recall that, Jerry Franklin's work indicated an annual rate of mortality of, these types of trees of, 0.31, 0.5% a year. Um, significantly less than the annual rate of mortality that we observed. But to get that probability of mortality to closer to zero, we need to increase the growth and rigor of these trees. That's what this data indicates, is that the probability of mortality is largely a function of growth. Trees that are healthy, they're growing robustly, they have a very low chance of mortality. So we need to get trees that are currently, have low radial growth to high radial growth. And if we do that, then we will be able to realize one of these more favorable scenarios whereby 60, 70, 80 years from now, people will be able to enjoy not as many old growth trees as we were able to enjoy. That ship has already sailed, but still a pretty, high amount of old growth trees. If we continue to allow old trees to suffer from excess competition, resulting drought stress, insect attack, fire, etc., then we're going to find ourselves with a quarter to a third less old growth trees than we have today, which is less than we had 10 years ago, which is less than we had 50 years ago, etc., etc.
Thank you. Yeah,
In,
thanks for
in a way, these results are pretty simple. It's not rocket science at all. We find that a lot of old trees are dying. The reason they're dying is because they exhibit low growth rates. They're not super competitive. They're drought stressed. They're stressed by competition. If we can reverse those competition dynamics, we'll have more old trees. If we don't, we won't.
thanks for
I,
simplifying it down.
I've
Um,
spent a lot of time in school to be able to say
yeah.
we're actually pretty obvious to anyone who's ever walked through a forest. I don't know.
Well, no, no, yeah, it's important. So Tyler asks, so ponderosa pine is well known for being adapted to dry conditions, and they were curious about your thoughts, James, on why Doug fir and Western juniper experienced a lower rate of mortality?
Well, uh, first is the age structure. I bend these trees into 150 and less, 150 to 300, 300 plus. Those are pretty crude age classes. In fact, there's, you know, very few Douglas fir that are older than 300 years of age in this data set. Let me go back to here.
Hmm.
Most of the really old trees that are most susceptible to death are ponderosa pine. Um, a 150 to 200-year-old Douglas fir is a marvel. It's a very rigorous, robust tree. It hasn't reached its maximum growth potential yet, so it still is increasing in height. Whereas, 300-year-old ponderosa pine has reached its maximum height, its maximum leaf area, and, the leaf area it has is under increasing strain from, lack of water and, transpiration demands, in part from competition. I think the other thing that's going on here is that Douglas fir is pretty susceptible to a variety of insect and pathogens. Stuff like spruce budworm will do a number on Douglas fir, but spruce budworm as an insect was relatively quiescent during the study period. So, although in the past we've had extensive mortality of Douglas fir from spruce budworm and other insects, we didn't see that during the 10 years. Um, but we did see quite a bit of mortality from mountain pine beetle and western pine beetle and other insects that attack specifically ponderosa pine. Um, so the relatively low levels of mortality of Douglas fir relative to ponderosa pine in that 10-year observation period reflects, I believe, differences in the age structure of those species and also differences in insect outbreaks. We were working during a time when there was extensive outbreaks of insects that target ponderosa pine, but not extensive outbreaks of insects that attack Douglas fir. That could change at any time. We've had extensive outbreaks of of insects that attack Douglas fir, and could easily see that reversed
Yeah.
in the future. Um, but Douglas
Yeah.
fir is an extremely resilient and resistant tree, particularly mature Douglas fir. Douglas fir, 100 to 200 years old, hard to kill. 250, 300, 350, 400-year-old ponderosa pine, although it is a drought tolerant species and a fire resistant species, significant buildup of surface fuels and significant competition dynamics have made it pretty vulnerable to drought and insects.
Mhm. Well, maybe to build on that, Barry asks if drought stress is a factor in the increasing mortality, do you attribute it more to unnaturally high numbers of competing grand fir Douglas fir and or unusually hot, dry condition during the 2010s? Maybe it's just a combination.
Yes, exactly. It's both.
Yeah.
The first culprit of old growth mortality is this bump you see here, of trees that have established in these stands since fire was excluded. We didn't sample all of the young trees that were present in these stands. In fact, we oversampled old trees so that in reality, this bump, which looks to be twice the size of the old growth bump, is actually more like 20 or 30 or 100 times the size. There's a lot more young trees than old trees. This bump is also composed of a lot of grand fir and Douglas fir, trees that have more leaf area than ponderosa pine. They have more leaf area, means they transpire more water, means they use more water, which means they're sucking these landscapes dry and really uh, um, really trading off with the competitiveness of the old growth ponderosa pine. The second thing that's going on is drought. We had pretty unusual, well, it's unusual in the context of the last 100 years. It's rapidly becoming the new normal. but pretty unusual deep drought from around 2012 through 2016 during that 10-year observation period, which killed a lot of trees. We also had, as we point out in the paper, an outbreak of ponderosa pine butterfly on the Malheur National Forest circa 2009 through 2012. Our observations didn't indicate that the ponderosa pine butterfly was killing that many ponderosa pine, but they did significantly defoliate ponderosa pine, which we think made them more vulnerable to attack by pine beetles. So I think that that also explains um, some of if not most of the mortality we observed. It's competition from young trees, it's drought, it's insects. That's the long and short of it.
So Jay asks a question from sort of the management side. Um, so he's wondering, can you go a little deeper into how this might inform prescriptions in dry forests? Jay works in the Mount Adams area in natural stands that have been treated, and he's concerned that they're still seeing elevated levels of mortality in ponderosa pine. So going in, doing the restoration work, and still seeing the ponderosa die.
Yeah. The original project that led me to core all these trees was reconstructing historical conditions. And we found that, throughout dry pine, through moist mixed conifer stands, that these forests historically were much, much, much less dense than they are today. These old growth ponderosa pine, western larch, are species that are well adapted to live in very dry, very hot, very fiery conditions. But in order to persist in those positions, in those landscape settings, they need frequent fire that kills younger trees and removes surface fuels. That's the environment they want to live in. If they don't live in that environment, as this research shows, they're highly vulnerable to competition. If you're observing highly elevated competition in your area, despite restoration, it could be that the restoration just happened too late. Ideally, we would have really gotten in front of this problem 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. In a lot of ways, particularly after recent drought years and insect attacks, we're really behind the eight ball and perhaps too late. In those stands in which we're not too late, the silvicultural implications are pretty obvious. You get rid of this bump here, you significantly reduce this cohort of young trees and stands, shifting species composition away from those water-hungry, high leaf area species, Douglas fir and grand fir, to give, these old growth ponderosa pine a chance. I rarely see silvicultural prescriptions that are too aggressive with respect to removing young, shade-tolerant trees.
Yeah, it's hard to take out enough of them.
Yeah. So I am truly sorry to see, the hard work of restoration happen. I know the folks on the Mount Hood and the Gifford Show are really working hard and, facing a lot of barriers to getting needed restoration done. And it must be frustrating to see trees die anyway. All I can say is that we need more better and of those types of silvicultural interventions.
Yeah,
So thanks for the work and good luck. Let me know if I can be of any assistance.
yeah, thank you. A couple other questions. Trent is asking about well, I'll just go ahead and read it. Did you look at or can you speak to the impact of precipitation interception and water use and or fire risk by conifer species, pointing to things like LAI? Um, and he's sort of thinking through the difference of just old trees and the ecological context.
Well, first of all, I think that most of the drought that we see in Eastern Oregon and throughout the Western United States, certainly the drought that I think has influenced these trees is a heat drought, a hot drought, and not a wet drought. It's not a lack of precipitation as much as it is elevated summertime temperatures. Um, Precipitation dynamics in Eastern Oregon haven't really changed that much over the last 100 years.
Mm.
We have somewhat earlier springs and somewhat declining snowpack. But the extent of spring precipitation, which I think makes such a big difference to tree growth, is not terribly dissimilar to what it was 50 or 100 years ago. What's really changed is elevated summer temperatures. And I think that that's what's causing the transpiration demands on these trees that are leading to mortality more so than a lack of precipitation. As for LAI, leaf area index, um, I think that the really important dynamic that's happening in these stands is that the younger trees, especially the grand fir and Douglas fir, which as you can see are the largest percentage of these younger trees, first of all, they haven't reached their maximum height yet. So they continue to add lots of leaf area. And when they add more leaf area, that means that they transpire more water and are taking water from the old growth trees. Second, they just have much higher leaf area than ponderosa pine, which is a very parsimonious user of water. Um, so the problem is only getting worse, which really, again, speaks to the need to remove this cohort of trees here. And, it's at this point, a relatively old cohort of trees. Many of these trees are 150 years of age, which to a lot of stakeholders is an old growth tree. So when you remove them, you're logging old growth. Um, Stands with a lot of these shade tolerant late cereal species that have infilled into the old growth ponderosa pine stands are also somewhat evocative of the structurally complex multi-layered stands that we think of when we think of, Douglas fir dominated temperate rainforests. So that too kind of creates the impression that we're logging old growth. But at the end of the day, what this research shows is that if you don't remove these shade tolerant trees, you're going to continue to lose old growth. What I would say is the real old growth in these stands. So that's, I think, the trade-off that stakeholders need to come to grips with. We really need to get rid of some of these 100 to 150-year-old trees if we're going to have 300-year-old trees into the future.
Yeah, I think that's probably looking at the time. That's a good spot to end on. I want to thank you again, James. Great presentation. Thanks also for doing the work in the first place. I think it's really you you seem to have a habit of really targeting current policy relevant topics. So I appreciate that because that's what we all need for work in the woods and to drive some thoughts. So thanks so much. And we've got another webinar planned on older trees in redwood country later on this fall. So we'll keep talking on this and hopefully many of you will be able to join us again. So thanks so much, James. And I look forward to interacting with all of you in different ways going forward, hopefully in restoration.
Thanks.
Okay, have a good day.